So let me invite the panelists, Chris and Eugenio, to come up front, and now we will open for questions. So please, Eugenio. Okay, we are open for questions. Any questions that you want to ask at this point? This one there? Yes, one here, just in front.
Thank you very much. My name is Ajay Markande. I'm the director for FAO for North America. Thank you very much for the presentation and the discussions. A couple of things that just came through to me. This is just something that's been a little bit troubling me. It's not a lack of understanding that is the issue. It's actually working or enacting on the understanding. So how do you see the trajectory as you move forward? And I think we've made it repeatedly, the point comes out, it's a highly complex problem. Finance doesn't talk to agriculture and doesn't talk to health, etc. So assuming that I'm the Minister of Finance, what is the message that you want to put across to me to say that, look, you really do need to understand? The other thing that, that we've been looking at, and I was working on this for a little bit, is the whole issue of managed transformation. It's not so much that agriculture needs to be viewed as a sector in its entity, and certainly I'm looking more in the Asian context in this case, but how do you manage the whole transformatory process, which goes from an agrarian to a non-agrarian economy, and how do you start to work with the sort of drivers on that? And the last thing, and I think this is a good point that you made, is how do individuals work on their things? And I wanted to remind us, and this is a good one, they're called the argumentative Indians, and we have Bhagavati and Sen on opposing poles with totally different messages to the government. So it'll be interesting to see your take on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, Eugenio, if you want to start answering?
You want to take more?
Yeah, or any other question right now? Yes, you? No? So I have one to add until you start asking more questions. How you align the objective function of the Ministry of Agriculture with the Ministry of Finance? Because they clearly have different incentives. You were mentioning, Eugenio, that they, in terms of food security issues, they care about supply and they care about availability. Okay. While if we want to have a policy targeting food security, which will be targeting access, which is more income so that you can purchase. So they have different objective functions. They have to respond to the farmers, and therefore they have to respond to giving them better prices so that they can produce more. So how you create this alignment of objective functions to make them talk to each other and to cooperate more? Any other question around here? No? Okay, so let's move with the panel and then we keep going. Eugenio?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the comments and questions. Thank you very much for being here. There are 3 points in the first question. Management of transformation, usually that's beyond the purview of macroeconomic policy. It's more like a long-term development process. So I don't think the book has a lot to say on that issue, except for the fact that to notice that sometimes you can think as macroeconomic policies as managing aggregate demand for a independently moving trend, which is long-term supply, and then you just try to stabilize aggregate demand around an independent trend of growth. The point that I was trying to make in the book is that, in fact, these two things are related. So how you manage the demand also affects the trend. So the trend is changing in part because of the demand is also changing. And in that sense, you could say macroeconomic policies do affect also the trend growth and the possibility of transformation. The main contribution, I think, to the orderly transition would be to maintain the economy on an even keel, try to avoid crisis, have a reasonably alignment of aggregate demand with aggregate supply. So if you have too little aggregate demand, you will have unemployment. If you have too much aggregate demand, you will have inflation and balance of payment problems. So you try to make sure that the aggregate demand is keeping the aggregate supply growth at a relatively even path. And that also is important because the macro prices have impact on the aggregate demand, but also on the aggregate supply. I mentioned the exchange rate, but also the interest. The interest rate affects not only aggregate demand through consumption and investment aspect, but also affect even the technological choices, and the choices between labor and capital will be affected by interest rates and wages. So there is what macroeconomics can do to help the transformation is, as I say, maintain aggregate demand on a path that is supporting the transformation that's happening on the aggregate supply, and maintain aggregate macro prices, avoid huge imbalances between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and huge misalignments in macro prices, so you don't have crises. Crises are very common in developing countries and are the main reason why development doesn't happen. Sometimes it's not that, it's the fact that every 2-3 years you are having a macroeconomic crisis in many developing countries, that the average growth over decades is low. The other two, I'm not sure if I can say much. Or perhaps for the first one, I would say this is what the person in the Ministry of Finance needs to understand related to agriculture. And also the people in agriculture need to understand the macroeconomic implications of the programs. No? What is not only how well designed is the subsidies or the consumer subsidies or the production subsidies, so what is the impact on fiscal policies in general? Or how is the impact on the monetary program of my credit program for agricultural sector? You need to understand that to also have a conversation with the central bank or the Ministry of the Economy. I'm not sure if I have anything to comment about the last point that you made, and how to align the objectives of the Ministry of the Economy and Agriculture. Well, usually you would need a president or a prime minister that really do have a view or a coordinating mechanism for the ministries that really put everybody to work together on a medium to short-term macroeconomic program and medium to long-term development program, and then you can make sure that everybody works together. If not, the tendencies will be for the agricultural sector or the minister to work on the specific issues of the sector without looking at the repercussions, and for the economic sector, they may be cutting, I don't know, investment in infrastructure or in R&D, which are crucial for development, and they will mostly be concerned about, maintaining the rating, the credit rating in the case of emerging markets, or they may be concerned about what the donors may be saying about the high deficit, and they may be cutting things that are crucial for development. So in that case, if you have a short-term macroeconomic program and a long-term development strategy that is enforced or is democratically discussed with the country, and then monitored by the president, the prime minister, or the similar level, then that's the only way that you can, I think, coordinate that.
Joe?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is perhaps instead of trying to align the finance minister with the agricultural minister, I think it's probably a good first step just to understand the consequences, for each to understand the consequences of the other's actions before those choices are made. And you can. That's certainly the case in a developed country such as the U.S., where I know that we've had a lot of. I can remember a fight over biofuel policy where, oddly enough, it was the Department of Agriculture that was actually arguing for a smaller target than the Treasury Department was at the time, just because of the ramifications it would have throughout the food system. But I think those are the sorts of things that oftentimes ministries are pretty stovepiped, and oftentimes finance ministers, and probably for the right reasons, have higher standing. And so, but I do think just again making the consequences known is an important first step.
Alejandro?
Yeah, let me add regarding the understanding of policies. I think emerging markets have done a lot of work lately to focus on their own shocks and not only keep theory developed in the north, it's being adapted. For example, central banks have learned quite a bit about what to do with commodity price shocks. They now differentiate from temporary or permanent shocks, and if they're permanent, they're not too worried about losing their inflation targets. I mean, they know this is probably just a one-time jump and not necessarily continued inflation. So I would say at the technical level, things have improved, more perhaps in central banks than in ministries of finance. No? But the other issue that I think is now coming back and is being debated with all these energy price movements and so on is, should we give subsidies to particular sectors, and do these sectors have sunset clauses or not? I mean, that I think is a bit less understood in many emerging markets. And going to your question, which I think is not easy, I think cabinets should be clear about the political choices being made. No? I mean, everybody should know what the political choice is and act accordingly. No? If I have to think of an example, I think in the 80s, many Asian countries followed policies that were a bit heterodox, no? Like directed credit or subsidized credit, which was something that was not very well seen at the time, and they have their issues. But these countries were able to show that these policies could be accommodated if you had sunset clauses or elements that would not make these policies permanent. So it's not easy, but I think it's doable as long as Eugenio says you keep the law of gravity of accounting relationships on hold.
Any other question, please? Miguel?
Well, number one, congratulations, Eugenio, on a great contribution. So my question is related to technology adoption and to some extent to add a little bit of dynamics into the, the framework that you presented. So to what extent technological adoption or technology adoption is related to macroeconomics? How can the macro help better technological or more technology adoption in the agricultural sector? Or should we just think about this as a just purely sectoral policy? I don't know if you can have a word on that.
Yes. Sam?
I'm curious about the distinction between commodity prices that Alejandro was talking about and agricultural prices that Eugenio was talking about. Is there a useful distinction to be made, or would the charts look Alejandro's charts look the same if we just had agricultural prices on them rather than commodity prices? Because after all, we have all the oil price changes, the iron ore prices changes, copper and silver and so forth. So it may look quite different if we did just the food component.
James?
Hi, James Stoller from IFPRI. Yes, I want to say congratulations. I think it's great that we're really pushing the need for this economy-wide perspective. I certainly can subscribe to that, and the need to worry about spillovers. But I'm wondering a little bit about your emphasis on macroeconomic risk and whether we have the tools that can mainstream sort of systemic macroeconomic risk inside the kind of research that gets done inside of IFPRI. Most of the work that researchers do here, working on the food system, are looking at worrying about policy attribution rather than sort of ex post policy attribution, instead of sort of ex ante policy risks. And I was just wondering if you have any ideas on the kinds of methods practical suggestions on the kinds of methods we could put into the hands of some of our colleagues here at IFPRI, including myself, to incorporate risk into our sort of policy recommendations.
Thank you. Yes, one question here.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Grubb with Oceana. I appreciated your discussion on the difference between prices for producers and consumers, and I see a lot of similarities in macroeconomic policy between fertilizer subsidies and fuel subsidies for fisheries. And so, I mean, both lower the cost of production and lower the cost to consumers, but they can both have unintended consequences that are negative in terms of environmental impact. I was wondering if you had any suggestions on how to best convey this real price, including the harmful effects of these policies to consumers, and if you had any suggestions on how to best convey that.
Any other question in this round? Okay, I have one more question. Do you think that the interlinkages when we bring agriculture and energy, agriculture and health, that helps to link more macro and micro in agriculture? Is that something that is changing the way the agricultural sector is being seen within the macroeconomic perspective? And the second one is, if I am a minister and I look at practices around the world, so if I look in Africa, fertilizers, I see the fertilizer subsidies in Malawi. It had a huge impact in terms of output and income for farmers at the beginning, but several years later we figured out that it created a huge fiscal deficit. It's linked to the equation that Eugenio presented. But initially, I would have argued that that's the way to go, especially if I want to create availability. And the World Bank supported that, for example. If I go to Brazil, I will see that most of the programs that they developed lately to create inclusion and growth in Brazil and to reduce poverty and inequality are related to subsidies, basically. You have many programs like the PA program, the Hunger Zero program, batteries of programs, all of them are subsidized. And why the Ministry of Finance of that country agrees to that. And that brings me to this issue of growth with inclusion or inclusion for growth. So up to what level, to create this synergy with the Ministry of Finance and Economics, you need to think of agriculture as a way to create that inclusion and therefore assume the cost for that as part of your fiscal deficit and focus more on getting the revenues to cover that gap, because it's the only way you can move forward in terms of reducing inequality. Eugenio.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this working? No, now it's working. Technological adoption and macro. I think there are two main links. One is the interest rate. Interest rate will affect technological choices. So you want, and that's part of why I think it's important to have relatively well priced, all the macro prices to be at levels that help with this smooth movement of the economy. So sometimes if you have a very tight inflationary target and you need a very high real exchange rate, real interest rate, that may affect not only the real exchange rate through different channels, but also may affect technological changes in a way that you. So I think that's one channel. The other channel through which macroeconomic prices policies may affect technology. The other one, of course, is to make sure that you have fiscal space to do the investments that you need to do on the expenditure side, which also requires an adequate revenue side, so you can create enough revenue to then allocate the expenditures in the best possible way. And one of the problems and that's part of the typology that I have a little typology there in the book as well, and you see that some of the lower income or rural countries, they also have very low levels of total expenditures compared to the GDP, let's say 20-25% of the GDP. And perhaps you need to go to 28, 29, and that additional amount needs to be invested in a lot of infrastructure, in technology. So the macro policy will help, I think, at least to these two channels to make sure that you can invest enough in technology and that the choices are not distorted because of the wrong interest rate. That would be my only small comment on that. What Sam was mentioning related to commodities in general and agriculture, there is a huge correlation. I did some calculations for a presentation that I did to the World Bank, and it's the correlation between metals the price of metals, agriculture, and oil is between 80 and 90%. So the first thing, sometimes from the agricultural sector, or people working in oil, or people working in metals, everybody look at all the supply side, demand side, specific to the product. But once you see the high correlation across all these commodities, then you realize that you have common factors, macroeconomic common factors at the world level, because there is no other way to explain how this huge correlation between all commodities, all the commodities basically as a group, not individually each one of them, but as a group, they move pretty close together, which in part is related to the fact that they are priced in dollars, and so the dollar affects the changes in prices of these commodities, and also related with the growth of the world economies also has an impact on commodities. So my guess, and the model that Alejandro presented, is terms of trade. Terms of trade include a lot of products, as you know, on the export side, and a lot of products on the import side. For Latin America, which is several of those terms of trade are dominated by the agricultural sectors, except perhaps in Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, but that's a separate one, and a little bit in Colombia, and Peru and Chile are dominated by metals. So I would probably say that if you use only agricultural prices, I'm not sure if you will get much effect on Chile or Peru, because the terms of trade are dominated by metals, and in Venezuela is dominated by oil. But as this term of trade has a different combination in each country, still I backtrack. Because of all the commodities are correlated, that you still may get something there, but that's just because other reasons, not because the price of food is terribly important in the case of the export price of food is terribly important in the case of Peru, let's say, or Venezuela. James, no, I think the issue of macroeconomic risks and how to incorporate that in the advice given by IFPRI. Well, I don't know if, I think it's very important, the economy-wide aspect that you mentioned. Maximo referred to the Malawi subsidies. And the work that you, James, did, and other people with you on the impact of the Malawi subsidies using the computer-generated equilibrium model of Malawi, that shows that beyond the micro impact, then you had a lot of multiplier effects from, so it would be interesting then to look at if that what sort of imbalances may be created or not in the fiscal accounts that may change some of the results that you got before, because you had a closure in the fiscal part of your model that didn't necessarily look at the general impact, but not necessarily how it was financed. So there may be some work to be done there, not only in terms of, and I think the Malawi subsidies were crucial. Once you see the huge impact in production and all the multiplier effects from that, you cannot say that was not very useful. But then the question may be, and going forward, it's a question that Maximo had, how that may affect through the fiscal constraints, how may affect the functioning of the economy in a way that keeps on hitting back to the agricultural sector and production. So basically, I think I didn't say anything that you don't know, James. Fertilizer subsidies, fuel subsidies, suggestion to convey the harmful effect. I think IFPRI has done a lot of work showing the impact of subsidies, fuel subsidies, or subsidies for crops transformed in, I'm guessing that you're referring to biodiesels or something like that, or that product. IFPRI has done a lot of work, and I just refer a little bit in the book to the work that has been done at IFPRI. And I think the link between energy and agriculture that Maximo and Joe referred to, they are crucial, and I think that will require more analysis, and that analysis is changing. In the book, I have some comparison of what happened in the 80s when it was what is happening now. In the 80s, you also had the macroeconomic factors increasing all commodity prices, food, oil, that mid-70s, and then you had a cycle of 10 years through which eventually policy changes and technological changes in agriculture and in energy. At that time was the expansion of deep sea oil production in the northern part of Europe. And that made prices of oil collapse in the mid-80s. So in the book, I was speculating about the possibility of, history never repeats itself the same way, but you could see this sort of same or sort of comparable parable playing out right now, in which you had also technological change in energy, in this case shale, gas, tight oil, etc., and a decline in the world growth, in the growth of the world economy, leading to a decline in commodities as it happened in the 80s, and sort of it's playing out. Of course, then that link between energy and agriculture is crucial and needs to be continues to be analyzed. How the links between health, well, I mentioned energy and health. I think it's important for the Ministry of the Economy. They are very much concerned about fiscal problems. If they have a huge imbalance, if they are an emerging market, if that may affect the credit rating, and then it will be more difficult to borrow, or what the impact may be on the donors in the case of low-income developing countries, if they are not getting the foreign aid may be cut off because the deficit is getting out of hand, and so on and so forth. So they may, I think it's important to maintain those accounting identities sort of balanced in a way that is sustainable in the middle term. But in that case, I think it's important to make sure that the Ministry of Economy and Finance, they recognize the importance of these investments in health, in energy, in technology, in infrastructure for the long-term growth of the economy. The only problem, as I see it in a lot of developing countries, is that the tenure of the Ministry of Economy is always, pretty short. 2 years, 3 years at most. So they are not necessarily thinking long-term. So that happens also at the political level more generally, not only the Ministry of the Economy. How can we help developing countries to think long-term? I don't know.
Thank you, Eugenio. Joe?
Let me comment on the comment about the co-movement of prices. I think, and certainly there are a lot of common, more general factors affecting prices that would cause them to move together. But I think a lot of these markets do have their individual fundamentals that will cause differences. And I think agriculture, for the most part, is probably less dependent on things like income growth. It is over the long run, obviously, and as diets change and things like that. But a recession, for example, doesn't affect in a developed country, probably has very little impact on food consumption. But droughts do, and so do bumper crops, and certainly if you look at agricultural prices, the drift downward began for at least the crop prices began in following 2012. Livestock, others remained high. They've also begun to come down. But you look at oil prices. Oil prices remained pretty high until just the fall of last year, or so late fall of last year, and then have dropped. And if you look on it at any of the indices like World Bank or others put out, has kind of caught up with that drop in ag prices. So if you look at the long time series, they look like they're moving together. But if you look, in the individual things, there's less of that. And certainly, the slowdown and the unanticipated slowdown in China economic growth has had impact on energy consumption, which is brought down energy prices, it's had an impact on metal consumption. And so you've seen these build up of stocks in both of these categories, much like you've seen in agriculture. But I would argue for slightly different reasons. Now, a devaluation of devaluation of currencies relative to the dollar, the fact that we have seen prices fall generally, I think, and that is much more tied to the more general thing. But I think, again, I would argue that at least looking at it day to day and even over longer periods, the individual fundamentals are important in these markets.
Alejandro?
Yeah, I will address first the point on technology adoption. One thing that we've studied at the IDB that is related to technology adoption and macroeconomic volatility is the fact that when firms are deciding whether to incorporate new technology, the more volatility you have in relative prices, the more difficult it is to make decisions on whether your investment is profitable or not. And so work we've done shows you that in countries that have more volatility of the real exchange rate, you tend to go and invest into industries which are less capital intensive, so they're more malleable, or it's easier to change a coffee shop into a restaurant than changing a pharmaceutical company into a restaurant. So that issue, I think, is important. Not that you don't want real exchange rate volatility. Healthy real exchange rate volatility is fine. What you don't want is huge changes in the real exchange rate like the ones you get during crisis. Regarding risks, one thing that comes to mind is, I mean, only very few countries have in their fiscal account any rule that will account for commodity price movements. No, I can think of Chile for copper prices, but you count them with your fingers. It's not a common policy, and that's something that should be addressed more often, I think. The other point, yes, regarding agricultural prices, if I were to do the calculations only with those, I agree. I mean, here you have the average country, but in some countries still agricultural exports are pretty high as a share of total. So countries like Argentina, for example, would be quite sensitive to that type of movement. I still don't know why countries like Brazil are very sensitive to that. I mean, it's a small share, exports are a small share of the economy, yet you graph the correlation, you graph GDP and terms of trade and commodity prices, and they track each other quite well. That's a puzzle. I don't have a question for that, an answer for that, sorry. Regarding Maximo's question, which is not easy to answer. I would say, yes, indeed, Latin America and many other emerging markets have done a wonderful job in terms of protecting the poor during this boom period that we've had. We definitely have invested in social assistance and health, and I think that should be done not just for altruism, but because it's important for our labor stock. But the thing that I've noticed in many cases is that sometimes the way subsidies are implemented introduce a lot of leakages, which we have to be aware of. No? For example, as a general point, price policies compared to income policies. No? If I were to think of several cases that have occurred in Latin America, we've gone into subsidies through price policies, which are intended to help the poor, but are really helping a lot more people than the poor. No? So if I put a subsidy on gas, yes, the poor are paying less for their gas, but so are a lot of other people. And we're now calculating at IDB the size of these leakages, and they're not minor. Sometimes they account to 1-2% of GDP. So I would focus, I mean, I definitely want to focus on equal opportunities, but with income policies rather than price policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. Okay, so thank you so much. Let me just close with three small, at least lessons that I take from this book. The first one is that policymakers will have to make choices, but it will be a big mistake to make a choice thinking only on my little vacuum of my sector or the little vacuum of my country without taking into account the world, the region, and the macro policies that my country have and how good and stable it is today. So if I want to implement a policy of a subsidy and I have a fiscal deficit, I will have a problem. If my exchange rate is over-devaluated or I am dollarized, I need to take that into account in any policy I make within that country. And within that region, if I am vulnerable in terms of how vulnerable I am and dependent to net imports and so on. So it's very important, and I think what the book tries to bring is which are the key elements that we need to look at it to be able to assess properly the choices I am making and to understand what will be the consequences of those choices, which sometimes could imply that I have to go to implement subsidies because that's the only way I can assure what I keep calling inclusive growth. The second one, and coming back to the three principles that Eugenio put in the book, the idea of having enough instruments to implement the policy you want, I think, extremely important. And it's even more important in the complexity of interlinkages that we have today. Because it's not necessarily only one, it's at least one. And in some cases, depends on the complementarities, how complex it could be. So having enough instruments to implement the policy and understanding how the other sectors will interrelate, I think is essential. Similarly, with the issue of targeting and the Bhagwati principle, it's important that the policy instruments has to be aligned to the problem I want to resolve or the objective I want to resolve. That's essential, and that is linked to how well I target also my policies. If I want to resolve extreme poverty, I don't need to subsidize the whole agricultural sector. I target those areas with policies that will satisfy that problem. And that's what normally we face. We face with countries trying to implement across-the-board policies and creating macroeconomic imbalances when basically they need to target to specific locations. And finally, the issue of distributional effects, which we don't hear too much about those, and which are extremely important in understanding the real effects that a policy could have, and how really it will affect others. Normally, we implement policy in agriculture that will benefit the larger farmers, assuming that will benefit the smaller ones. So my selling of the policy is relating to the poorest and to the smaller farmers. But at the end of the line, I am only benefiting the larger farmers. So with that, let me thank you enormously to the panelists, Joe and Alejandro, for being here, and especially thank Eugenio and congratulate Eugenio for this great book. Thank you so much to all for coming.